I'm John Duncan, Green Goods Manager for Greengate Garden Centers, and today we're just going to do a little introductory on growing vegetables here in Calgary. So first thing we're going to talk about is tomatoes, which is always the challenge here with our cold nights. So a couple different things I would recommend. At this point in the game, seeding them is a little too late. If you were seeding them, you should have started those back in February. But for now, you should be starting with either a 4-inch or a big 6-inch like this. So usually what I do is I get a big tomato, and then I'll just grow them in a big pot because I find it a lot easier to get them all nice and warm. So I usually use at least a 10-gallon pot because of the amount of the root system you're looking at here. And then what I would do is, doesn't matter the cultivar, but this one I'm just using Rapunzel here. And you sink it right down to the bottom of the pot. And before you do that, you want to remove all your side suckers, which are all these side growths here. And you just pinch them all off. And they just break off here nice. And then you want to remove all your bottom leaves as well if you're growing in a pot, because they're all going to be under the soil level anyways. Check your height. Okay, go up a little bit higher. And if anyone has any questions, just put your hand up or wave at me. So now so all the leaves are above what the soil level will be. So center that in the pot. And then you're just going to pull him out of his pot. And put him right into the middle there. Now I like to use, if I'm growing any of my fruits and vegetables, always use an organic compost. We all use sea soil here at the store because it's one of the best composts you can buy. Then what you want to do is just fill that completely right up, stem and all. And right to the top just like that, leaving a little bit of a well for when you water. Now there's two different options you can do for if it's a determinate variety, which means a tomato that grows to a certain height, then sets fruit and doesn't continue on, but like Rapunzel here, which is indeterminate, so it continues to keep growing like a vine, so it'll get taller and taller and taller. So if it was a determinate variety, like bush beefsteak or bush early girl, a lot of the bush varieties, you could use a tomato cage and sink that in like that. But because this guy's going to get over 6 feet tall, I would recommend using 6-foot or 7-foot poles in a teepee. All I did was just tied the top with a string there at the top. And then as this tomato grows, you'll remove all the side suckers that will come out at each axle, and then tie it up with a stretchy tie. As this grows up, just keep attaching it as it grows up to support it. And then with tomato plants, because they are high calcium feeders, I would recommend a slow release fertilizer like this Nurseryland brand. It's high in calcium. It should say some low numbers plus added calcium. And what I do when I first plant, I'll take a handful, spread it around the top of the plant, work it in the soil a bit, and then every week or so I'd continue to keep adding all the way through the season. And then I would place this guy in a very bright location, so south or southwest side of the yard. And just keep it evenly moist all the time. And the reason why you want to keep it moist plus the calcium is tomatoes, because they're high calcium feeders, get a problem with blossom end rot. And what blossom end rot is when the flower side of the fruit turns black in caves, and that's just a lack of calcium or infrequent watering. So you want to make sure this guy stays evenly moist all the time and always had added calcium all the time. It will help to reduce that problem. But if your plant tends to go dry, wet, you run the risk of a higher chance of blossom end rot.
Could you put eggshells in the bottom when you start?
You can. The only problem is by the time those are broken down, you'll be working on it next year. They take quite a long time. That's why I would add a fertilizer that contains available calcium. They're really good if you add them to your compost, because then that breaks down and you have added calcium into your compost. But for this year, most of the time that's not available. So make sure it's like an available calcium source.
Can you put an Epsom salt?
Yeah, well, Epsom salt is magnesium sulfate, so that will help to green and get lots of growth and lots of flowers, but it doesn't solve the calcium problem. But you can, yeah, because there's sodium.
Does it solve the
A little bit, but more so because you still need added calcium to solve that problem. So frequent watering and constant calcium will help with that.
Frequent watering as in once a day, twice a day?
Depending on the season, like this time of year, maybe once a week. Not that you want it outside at night right now because we're freezing. But as we get into summer, like I'd be watering them, leave in the morning to go for work, and then when I come home from work, watering again. Yeah. But the bigger pot you use, the more evenly it dries out. So do go with at least a 10-gallon for each tomato. Like don't go anything smaller or you will run the risk of it drying out in between each watering too fast.
Could you somehow make that into a, what they call an urban bucket?
What was that?
Could you somehow make that into an urban bucket where you would put another container on top of that and then run a drainage?
Yeah, you can do that as well. Yep, just to get the volume of soil, and it will root out from the stem. The only problem with one side effect that you can get with tomatoes is if you get the grafted varieties, which help to increase your yield there, is you would never plant a grafted tomato below, like lower in the pot. You'd always leave it at soil level because you don't want to lose the benefit of having that other cultivar as the root system down below. Because if you filled it up to here, this would just root out and you would lose the benefit. But for varieties that are seed grown, like straight seed grown, I would do this. Still plant in a big pot like this, but just don't sink it in the ground. Yeah.
One more question. I was just over there by the tomatoes. You have a tomato ketchup one,
Yep.
potato one, and it's got a potato in the bottom?
Yeah, so that's the other exception to that is that's the only one where you would bury the potato side. So what I did last year was, let's say this was the ketchup and fries variety. So it's planted, everything was planted in there. And then what I did was I cut a pot the same size as this and cut out the bottom and slit the side and wrapped it around so it's inside this one. And then as the tomato grew, I kept adding soil to get as many potatoes as possible. Does that make sense?
Say that again.
So for instance, like if that was the ketchup and fries, because the potato side is on the bottom,
Yeah.
so you planted it at ground level. And then I take a pot that's empty, the same size as the one I currently use, like for same pot, this one, and then remove the bottom and split it down the side, put it around the plant. And then as the tomato grows, I keep adding soil so that there's more and more room for the potato. As the potato grows inside, it produces more potatoes inside the pot. Yeah.
So what do you put in the second pot?
Soil as the tomato grows.
So the pot becomes taller and taller.
Yes, so it's like two pots on top, and then as it grows, you just keep adding soil. Yeah, yeah. Was there any other questions about tomatoes?
Yeah, should we go?
Sure.
So you put your tomato in a pot. Can you put it in
You can for sure, not a problem at all. What you can do to increase that root system is dig a trench sideways, and lay it this way in the ground. So all this would root down. The reason why you don't want to go straight down if this was soil, because this would be so cold down here that it would take so long for your tomato to grow because it's always sitting in cold root system. But by laying it in a trench, like you'd remove all these leaves here and just have this guy up and then stake it up that way. So you get that mass root system to support that plant so it stays more evenly moist and yeah.
And that goes for both types of tomato.
Yeah, yeah.
What's the more common disease for?
Blossom end rot, which is it's just cultural, and then late blight is a problem we get when we get a lot of wet weather and you're watering on top of the leaves, especially in June, and you get a lot of spots.
The tomatoes need also the fertilizer process, right?
Yeah, that's why you just use this. Yeah.
How many times in a month do you fertilize?
So I probably about once a week, every 2 weeks, all the way through. Yeah. Some of the packages will say after flowering, but I always had lots of fertilizer because tomatoes are high feeders, so they always benefit from a lot of compost. And the compost has a lot of nutrients too, but they'll use that up, and then you just continue to fertilizer. If you're not fertilizing enough, you'll start to get a lot of yellowing leaves. But when you start seeing fruits being set, and it gets closer and closer to the end of the season, like in August and July, and your fruit starts maturing, a lot of your leaves will start to fall off or turn really ugly. Don't worry about that. As long as you're getting lots of fruit, that's the most important thing. So don't worry about a few spots in the end, as long as you're getting production. If you have yellow, ugly leaves and you're not getting any production, then come in and talk to one of us here. Yeah.
If the tomato has a mildew problem, how do you solve it?
Repeat again, sorry?
A mildew problem? Like the mildew.
Oh, mildew, that's usually a form of too much moisture getting on the leaf at the wrong time of day. So I mean, if it's out sitting in the rain, you have no control. But if you overhead watering, or it's a lot of tomato plants very close together and not enough air movement, that will cause that. If you do get that problem, your best bet is to remove the excess leaves that are really, really damaged. And then you can also spray with a topical spray of BTK, which will help to reduce that continuing on the plant as well.
What kind of spray?
It's BTK, but Bacillus thuringiensis spray. And it's safe, organic. Yeah, it helps to reduce the mildew.
The best way is to cut them out.
Remove the most affected leaf, of course, as much as you can. And then if it's really bad, then you want to spray. And if you've had problems year after year after year, then I would start spraying as soon as you plant it, just every week or after every rain. Just keep spraying every time it's wet, so that you're reducing that spread of onto the new growth.
How would you promote growth at first, since your plant becomes big, and,
Yep.
and then not promoting fruits yet? How do you do that?
Well, most of that you'll want to remove all your side growth that we were showing, because you want to promote flowering. You still will grow a tomato plant as long as there's lots of food there. It's going to grow. So you just want to make sure you remove all the side growth so you're not excess growth off. So all the ones that are in the axil in between each leaf, you'll just remove that.
And that would promote growth, right?
Upwards, yeah.
Upwards, right?
Yeah, you don't want to promote side growth because you're just producing more and more plant that has less and less flowers. Yeah, because in the end you want more fruit than you do a big plant. Because if you just water them all the time, you'll get a great big bush that's unmanageable and very few flowers and very few fruit at the end of the season. Yeah.
So do you have to use dirt? Like there's not enough nutrients in our own soil, like in our backyard. You have to use
If in a pot you're talking about,
even on the ground.
I would still add a compost because our soil is really, really heavily clay. So by adding a lot of organic matter, you add nutrients, plus it'll stay moist longer and you'll get less of that problems. Yeah, yeah. And usually for vegetable gardens, you should be adding minimum 3 inches of a good compost or manure to your vegetable beds every year to enrich that soil.
Is it in liquid?
Yeah, every year before you plant, yeah.
Hi, sorry, I apologize if you covered this, but
Yeah, no problem.
if you are using a raised bed
Yeah,
instead of straight into the ground,
Yeah.
if you use a raised bed, should you then also just do a mixture of like black earth plus some compost?
yeah, you should be adding some compost or manure every single year. Yeah, yeah. Ideally 3 inches is what you should be adding of compost or manure. Or if you are using manure, make sure it says well rotted, Don't just be getting it from a farm, because then it'll be too high nutrients and you'll get burning. But if you're buying like usually a bagged product from here or something, that's well rotted manure, so that's good. But it really improves your structure. You get less problems with improper root development and better plants by adding that soil every year. Because our soil itself is pretty high clay, so it's hard for plants to really root out well. I think this has got to be as loud as I... Can you hear me now?
It was louder before.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. And then that's the same process with peppers as well. If you're growing peppers in the plant or in the pot or in the ground, except the only problem is you don't want to sink these guys down, because that stem will rot. It doesn't root out. But they require a lot of calcium as well. So the exact same process, except you're pruning off side growths that don't have flowers. At this stage, these guys are already starting to set fruit because they're so far advanced already, which is nice. Especially with our short season, it's always nice to get a little bit higher advanced.
Isn't it too soon though for flowering?
What was that again?
Isn't it too soon right now though?
To plant them outside, yes. Yeah, because we had, like last night was -3 here at the garden center, so they would be toast. But it gives you that idea of what you can be doing. But at this time of year, you want to get your plants, then maybe do the in and out if it's going to drop below 4 degrees, especially for tomatoes, peppers. Things like if you're planting lettuce, kale, those could be already outside. They're cold crops, same as cabbage, kale, spinach. They like cool weather, but your warm crops like tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, melons that can't tolerate any frost, you don't want those outside yet until after the May long weekend. Sorry, you had a question there? Yo, yeah.
I'm in a fairly new community that's going to be putting in a community garden.
Okay.
I have no experience with any vegetable anything yet, so I'm very green with this. When would I start planting, I guess, tomatoes in like a community garden setting where I can't baby it?
I would wait till after the May long weekend so that less of chance of frost has passed.
Okay.
But you could be, as I said, like your lettuce, kale, your cool crop stuff, like radishes, all that cool crops can be started now. I've already planted all that. Some of that stuff has already been seeded and is already up already because it'll tolerate the cool. Yeah. Well, May is a write-off, so if I don't do it before, I can't. But things like peas can be planted now, but beans I always wait till closer to the end of the month.
Okay, so after May long weekend, I have to plant something at least 4-inch size or bigger?
Well, you'd want to already started plant at that point. You wouldn't want to be starting from seed because you won't get flowers till well after frost is passed.
Not after seed, but
Yeah.
if I'm starting after May long in that community garden, I want to start something that's already...
I would recommend something bigger, yeah. So 4 or 6 inch or even bigger, yeah. Yeah. Any other questions at all?
No, my peas are still growing. My beans died here.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, they don't like the cool.
Or a tomato, we put them already on the ground, and they seem to actually took the frost very well.
Oh, you're really lucky. Yeah.
They're still alive, so.
Yeah, you're just really lucky, yeah. But as I said, like, I know what we got at the tree lot last night, so.
Would you cover it
If you're running a risk of frost, can you plant it like a frost cloth, a thin blanket, towel, something just to insulate a little bit so that it doesn't get touched with frost. Yeah, until next couple of weeks when things should be starting to warm up here. So for like those cool crops that we were talking about, the things that could be planted outside. So like your lettuce, pre-start lettuce can be planted out now in rows, spacing them out. Also, you still have more than enough time to start do some seeding too. So usually what I do with like lettuce and my kales is I pre-start some inside, so they're little guys, and I space them all out. So what I usually do is I pre-start my first batch of cabbage, kale, and lettuce in the house already a few weeks before my first date I can plant, and then every 2 weeks I seed to the end of May, and that gives me a continuous crop throughout the summer. And I like them when they're nice and still short and small leaves. That's my personal preference. But if you're wanting them to grow into heads, you should space them out. So give them like a foot each distance to get that nice big head if you want it to look like the grocery store. But if you're just growing for salad, then just have a row and grow them side by side, and then just thin as you thin them out so that they're spaced so they don't get too tight together.
Would it be too cold inside
As long as there's good light, depending on the seed that you're growing. Like if you're growing like the cold crops, you're probably okay. If you're growing things like tomatoes, I wouldn't risk that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But your cabbage, kale, lettuce, those things can tolerate. They actually germinate better in the cool. Because if you do that same germination in August, they just never come up because it's just too warm. Yeah.
Potatoes?
Potatoes? Yep.
Cold or warm?
I always wait till the soil's it's warmed up a little bit. You can start early. Right now, because you should be putting them out in the sun to get them to sprouting. These guys are already doing it, but so usually you want to, when you first get your seed potatoes, you want to sit them out in a sunny location, like in a bright window, so that they start to produce and green up on the outside, and then they'll start to germinate like this. These ones are already ahead of the game. And then I usually leave, I do mine in half, but usually you want 1 or 2 eyes per each cut to maximize your yield. My vegetable garden isn't that huge, so I do them whole. So after they sprout, you just cut them into sections so you have a couple eyes per section. And then what I do is I dig a hole, a trench, and plant them. The soil's already mixed with compost and manure. Plant them in and just cover them. And then as they grow all season, I slowly backfill the soil so that you get more and more potatoes rooted out. Now you can also do the same thing if you don't have, same with the tomatoes there. You can do them in a container just like that, or a potato bag is really good. And that process is exactly the same as when you heal them. So you put like a couple potatoes at the bottom, and you'll add 6 inches of soil or compost. And as they grow, you just keep filling until the bag is full. And then at the end of the season, when they start to yellow, at that point is when they are ready for harvest. So depending on the variety, it can be anywhere between mid-July all the way till frost date. The exact same process there. You could for sure, yeah. There's no reason why you couldn't, yeah. Yeah, and you could do the same thing in the pot as well, yeah. Yeah. It's just nice at the end of the season, you can just fold this up and you're done, yeah. But there's no reason why you can't do it in a pot or in any other disposable bag, yeah.
Can I use a clay pot?
You can for sure, yeah. Only thing if it's non-glazed, it will dry out faster, so you have to watch how many. Yeah.
Can you just use a regular container that you bought in the store? I have one that's sitting on my counter. It's got, buds all over.
The reason why you technically, yes, you can. The only thing is because those aren't clean seed potatoes, if there's a disease on that and you grow it like in your garden, you could infest that disease because they've been stored for a long period of time, while your like seed potatoes are certified disease-free to start with, so you know you're not adding to that problem. Well, you don't know that they could just harvest that and had a problem with their potatoes and you'd never know because they were only meant to go into the food. Not that they would harm you, but you don't know that you could be introducing a disease, a pest problem into your own. Depending on, like if it's got really scabby, but you just never know, right? It could be on just the spores could be on there. Was there any other questions?
But if you've had seed potatoes from somebody that's grown it in the garden or from last year that you bought seed potatoes and now you still have some left and they're starting sprouting, you could plant those.
Oh, you could for sure. It's just the same thing as you still never know what's on there, right? Even though you could harvest them from your own yard, you might not have a problem this year, but there might have been a little bit at the end of the season, and then if you start seeing problem, then I would start with a fresh seed potato again. You want a minimum of 6 hours of sun a day is a minimum. I mean, you will get fruit in lower light, but it'll be happier. But they're high light too, yeah. Yeah, almost all your vegetables are as much sun as possible, yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Or something you'd like me to cover that I didn't? It's a huge topic, so there's lots more, of course. But.
Is Swiss chard and collard greens also a cool crop?
Yeah, so you can start those early. They do like the cool, because when the heat of the summer comes, all those cool crops tend to bolt or flower out, and at that point you'd either switch that up and plant something else. Onions are another one you can start now too. they like the cool too.
So the
Oh, yeah.
peppers should be planted beside the tomatoes.
Same kind of conditions, yeah.
Yeah.
If you're doing it in a pot, the full sun, as much heat as possible all day. Like I grow mine on my southwest wall, so they're in sun from like 11 o'clock all the way till the sun sets at the end of the day. Yeah.
I have a raised bed garden.
Mm-hmm.
And how would you recommend doing the soil conditioning and rotation?
Usually what I do is if when you first build the bed, I would do like sea soil, good manure, topsoil just to build up your volume, and then every year add a compost or manure. After 3 to 4 years, I would be adding some gypsum and rock phosphate to increase that in there to break up the clay that does come in. Well, the gypsum and the rock phosphate, I do it every other year. After a mature, the first year is pretty easy, and then you have to start doing all those extra amendments when you get into multiple years.
Limestone is
Well, you can. Only problem is our pH is so high, and if there's mixed in garden soil underneath, like our yard soil, our pH of our soil is so high that you're just adding to that. So I usually add a gypsum, rock phosphate, and lots of compost to keep that acidity down. Yeah, or keep the alkaline down, sorry.
I thought the soil is more acidic with planting more.
Yeah, but because if there's garden soil in there, because our soil here is so buffered high pH of 7.5, 7.5, that it takes a lot of years to get that pH down. Yeah. Yeah. If you live more on the coast or in Ontario where it's more acidic, then you're always adding more lime. But adding your rock phosphate, lots of compost will help to bring that pH down.
We have 2 kids to test us.
We sure do, yeah. 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 But typically our garden soil is usually around a 7.5. So
And what should it be?
ideally 6.5, but you'll still get good production even if you're not, yeah. Yeah. You could get better if you can get your pH down a little bit. But. Any other questions at all?
You will be covering herbs, right? Like basil, parsley.
I can cover that quick if you want. I didn't bring any with me. So for instance, like the easier herbs to grow that tolerate more cool growth are things like your rosemary, sage, oregano, mint are really hardier herbs. Things like basil, cilantro, I would keep in a pot that you can move in and out. Basil, I always call it like the Goldilocks plant. Doesn't like it hot, doesn't like it cold, doesn't like it wet, doesn't like it dry. It really wants to live in the Mediterranean, not that I blame it. So it's usually with basil early on in the season, if I started inside or if I bought the plant, I leave it inside the house, use it up, rebuy it again, use it all up. And then as we get past that into June where it's warmer and a little bit drier conditions, then I'll pot it out and leave it outside. But with basil and cilantro are the two they're very soft. But all those other ones like your chives, mint I would put between a rock and a hard place, control where it's very aggressive. You plant mint once and you'll have it for the rest of your life. So what I usually do in that circumstance is I just have a large pot, good compost in there, plant a plant in it, sink that in the ground, and then it keeps it all nice and contained if you're growing it in a vegetable garden. Or if you're just growing in a pot, just grow mint in its own pot because it will take over. Yeah.
Is thyme a hardy one as well?
It can be, yeah. Most of the times are pretty hard. Oregano, yeah. Most of the perennial ones are pretty good. It's the annual, especially mint, basil and cilantro that are the most.
Can they regrow every year, like rosemary and thyme?
Rosemary won't because it's not hardy here. But thyme will, sage will, oregano will,
On lavender.
lavender, depending on the cultivar, yeah, will. If we have a good snow cover in the winter, it will survive. If we have poor snow cover, then sometimes it gets burnt down too much. Parsley, chives, dill is annual one too. It doesn't like it cold either or wet. But yeah, those hardier ones like thyme, oregano, marjoram, mint, those are the toughest ones that will come back year after year after year. Yeah. And then after a few years, you kind of need to replace it. They get a little raggedy and woody, and then And I don't fertilize my herbs, so I just use if I'm using in a container, it's just straight compost. Or if in the garden I just add compost or manure, I don't fertilize them because you don't want to promote a lot of growth, because the more fast growth you get, the less flavor you get. So if you want that really good flavor, then stress them out a little bit more, make them work for their growth, and you'll get a much better tasting herb. Yeah.
When you have basil inside, I found that in my house for some reason it attracts teeny tiny little flies.
It's because because you have to keep it so wet because it dries out. Yeah. If you let that top inch go dry, which basil can be, you almost need to water it a little bit every day. Yeah. Usually most plants I always recommend watering thoroughly. That one I kind of give a little bit. Sometimes I get annoyed and I just chop it all off, make pesto that night, and then buy a new one because that's just the nature of that plant here in our cold nights, because it's mostly our cold nights. And they can tolerate cool night if they're dry going into cold night, but it's always like you just watered and then we have a cold night. It's just Murphy's Law. So I usually keep that one. I just keep replacing it. Just cut it off, use it all, and rebuy it. So never feel bad if you kill basil. It's just the nature of the beast. You're not failing, it's just the nature of the plant. So
How do you control pests without using herbicide?
the hose is really good. Wash them off. Controlling a lot of pests on your vegetables or herbs is just spray them off with the hose. I don't like to eat chemicals, so I would prefer to eat bugs than I would to eat chemical. Slugs. There's two options. There is slug baits that are just iron based that are good, that I use like in my vegetables, especially with lettuce, because I grow a lot of lettuce. So before I even plant, I put down slug bait, the iron based one, which is safe. And then I add every 3 weeks, sprinkle it around the edge of all my beds are all raised around the edges. And then do that. Or you can get copper tape or copper netting and put that around your more like your lettuces and stuff that they really tend to attack. Yeah. And then just remove it that next spring and then just keep adding it back every year. Yeah.
I just heard this week that June bugs are black beetles. Slugs?
They do. Yep. All those
Where do you get them?
you don't buy them. If you give them places to hide, like mulch, big piece of wood, something for them to hide during the day, help to promote them to be around your garden. And then don't spray. Yeah.
We were told ladybugs is very good for your kids.
Yeah, they're very good. Yeah. It's funny. I used to work at a organic tomato house, and some of the grocery stores paid more if there was insects on their lettuce, because that meant we had not sprayed, even though we were organic anyways. But just as a funny story, yeah. There was a couple organic stores that would pay more for our buggy stuff than they would, because their customers were so like, oh, I know this hasn't been sprayed for that reason. So, yeah. Any other?
What about carrots and zucchini?
So carrots can be direct sown. Usually what I recommend, because I only have so much time in May because I work full time as a horticulturist, is I use the tape because it pre-spaces them out, or you have to go back and thin and thin and thin. Those can be started now, and then they harvest in fall. Same thing with beets and a lot of your root vegetables that are really small seeds that it's hard to space out and to thin. And I always get ahead of it. I'm like, oh, I'm going to get around to thinning it, and then all of a sudden it's June and I'm now pulling up actual plants, and it's hard. You do more damage. So the tape simplifies that quite a bit. Zucchini, melons, and stuff like that, I plant well after chance of frost, because they don't even need to go to 0 in their toast, so they're really sensitive. Yeah, and you can direct sow those, or you can pre-start them inside the house in a small pot and just plant them out. But even now, you could still start them already. You could start today and be ready in 2 weeks to plant outside after the May long weekend. Any other questions? Okay, well,
Sorry, one
that's
more.
okay. Oh, no worries.
How do you safely thin out a rhubarb plant? My friend would like part of my plant or one of my plants. How do I remove it?
They transplant really hard. So yeah, they don't take transplant really hard. So what I would recommend, if you're going to do that, first thing in the spring before they start to pop their heads up, and then cut it. Yeah, but you do run the risk of killing your plant. They really don't take to transplant very well or to division. If you see one a little bit farther out, that might be your best bet. But do accept that if you do try, you may lose. There is a chance of you losing your clump too.
Okay.
Yeah.
And if for some reason I miss the seed coming up through,
Yep.
can I give it the seeds?
Yeah, some varieties will produce seed, like seed that will germinate. Some won't. Usually that means to get seed, you usually need 2 different cultivars. Yeah. And when you do have multiple cultivars, you run the risk of having lots of seed germinate everywhere. Like that's my problem because I have one of different things. So, but it's not that bad. They're easy to pull up. Yeah. But you're usually better off just buying a new plant and giving it that way. But you do run the risk, just to warn you. Yeah.
I'm determined failing to make kabocha squash
Okay.
because I see other people making Halloween pumpkins. So is it possible to make kabocha squash, or do is there a male and female in a packet of seeds, or how do I do
It's male and female flowers on each plant.
Okay,
So I would recommend at least having 2 to 3 plants
yeah.
so that the male and female of one plant will be open at the same time.
Plants growing, but no.
Yeah, that's usually why. And the squashes are also very high calcium feeders too.
Really?
Yeah.
So I'll plant them close to the tomatoes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you actually grow, like let's say peppers or or a squash.
Yep.
If you have 2 different squash.
Yeah.
Okay, like let's say you have a butternut, like a
Mhm.
butternut spaghetti squash.
Yeah.
Can they actually
They will cross with each other. Yep.
Same with like we do have. Like,
But yeah.
We do also have a bunch of gooseberries that are
Yep.
growing.
Yep.
But we just bought like a red gooseberry and then.
Yep, they cross, and they self-pollinate themselves, so it's not a big deal. Yeah, they self-pollinate. Yeah.
Let's see, 2 plants for that.
No. There is like things like your honeyberries are like that. They're very strict on what they do. Pears are like that. Plums are very strict on who they pollinate with.
How about those red currants, because they're in the same family, aren't they? Red
Yeah, and they self-pollinate themselves. So they will pollinate if you just had one, they will pollinate themselves. Yeah. Yeah.
The kabocha squash too? Pollinate itself?
No, you do need a male of one flower to be open at the same time. Yeah. Yeah.
What's the big thing about the heirloom tomatoes? Like, what makes those tomatoes so special?
Really, that just heirloom means that it was grown. The seed is produced in open pollination. So, like there'd be a field of tomato plants that's the bees do all the work, and then we collect their seed. That's basically what that means. Well, when you have non-heirloom, it means that they've been very strict. Man has done the pollination, or very controlled conditions to keep that genetics the same. That's the difference. That's really what that means. One is seed is produced in a field where bees just cross between themselves. They do all the work, or the wind does it. The other one where it's non-heirloom, it's been cross. Man has done it, or
So technically, a Roma tomato could be an heirloom tomato if it was pollinated naturally.
technically, yeah.
Or like a fifteen or whatever, like any type of.
But that's basically, in a nutshell, that's how that works. Yeah.
Can you quickly talk about strawberries? Is it, like, do they need as much calcium as the tomatoes?
No, they just need really lots of organic material in their soil, and you need to heavily mulch them so that the fruits don't touch the soil and rot. So lots of organic material in the soil, and then heavily mulched. Hence why they're called strawberries, is because they're usually mulched with straw, just to keep the fruit from touching the ground, which is where they rot. Yeah. So full sun, lots of organic material in the soil, and then mulch them to keep them moist and to keep their fruit from touching the soil and.
Growing it in the garden in like a row.
Yep.
That row you put the strawberries.
Yep.
You mulch that row.
On either side, yeah. So that when the fruit doesn't touch and rot, and it keeps it moist, and it keeps the weeds down too.
And it's okay for the other, like whatever is beside them.
Yeah, yep, yep.
So you see in stores strawberries in baskets and like you do them in pots and stuff
Yep.
like that. Do you recommend that, or is that just kind of a gimmick?
It's just either way what works for you in your space.
Oh, okay.
The ones in the
still do well in
Yep, the ever-bearing variety is always ever-bearing in the baskets, but they're usually ever-bearing, which means they continue to flower and fruit all season long. Yeah, that's what that means. So what they just flower fruit, but at the end of the year, if you don't plant that in the ground, it's not coming back in that pot.
It's just an annual.
Yeah, but if you live on a deck and have full sun, you want a little bit of fruit of your own, it works perfectly well. Same as you can do tomatoes, some of the varieties, tomatoes in hanging baskets as well. Yeah,
So what's the benefit of having like upside down hanging baskets?
that is a gimmicky thing.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, that's all it is. Yeah, it still works. It's just I mean, you could take any tomato and it will grow. It wants to grow this way, like up, but just taking up, it's just space, right? It's just to allow people to have fruit and vegetables in a smaller area, like on a deck or whatever, if you don't. And if you have the space to plant out in a garden or in a pot, that works just as well.
Any tips about raspberries?
Lots of organic material, and have them between a rock and a hard place so that you keep them confined. Yeah, yeah. And then every year, and you should be removing the old canes, the oldest canes. Yeah.
So you see the growth at the bottom, so you do have to remove.
Yeah, so it's usually 1/3 every year. So like the oldest ones this year, and the next year the old one. And so you always have a 3-year-old. So they're all different ages. You don't want to do them all at once because then you might not have any fruit that year. But you do the oldest ones, the oldest, thickest ones, remove those, and the next year do 1/3 of those, and then every 3 years you regenerated that shrub. Yeah.
I see you have corn here, and I'm kind of curious. We're never lucky with corn.
Corn is hard in Calgary. It's our cold nights. We can grow the plant.
But
It doesn't flower. Yeah.
it doesn't tend.
Yeah.
But when it does, we get a little stub,
Yeah.
it's not really-
That's just because of our altitude here in Calgary compared to like Tabor, because they're lower than us and it's warmer there at night. That's our problem. It's our altitude and the cold nights. Yeah.
Is there anything you would recommend to actually promote growth for these?
Other than if you want to grow corn in a greenhouse, which is a little overkill for corn. I mean, it's a nice plant to grow, but it's just that you won't have large production like you were if you're farther south, like in Tabor or Medicine Hat, where it's warmer, or in Saskatchewan or BC or Ontario.
Box gardens, there's this asphalt that you can box garden. Is it annual planting, or is there something you definitely shouldn't plant beside another stuff?
I do, when I do plant a lot of flowering, like especially things like marigolds and stuff that promote a lot of pollinators to come in, like a lot of your hoverflies and bees in to help to pollinate. And because of their scent, they do distract some of the pest bugs away, but yeah. Yeah, yeah. I usually do plant flowers with my vegetables just to bring in those pollinators and predatory insects.
So Lee Valley had a thing last week in their female flyer
Okay.
where you could, it was about 8 inches of dirt on top, 21 inches square.
Yeah.
And you could, it had spaces for hanging things to grow down, like a tomato plant.
Okay.
Would peppers grow too?
Because of tomato plants, their stems are more pliable. Pepper stems are pretty rigid, so if they get bent or broken, they snap right off.
So it's a real giveaway.
A little bit, yeah. But it's that small space gardening, trying to like
Yeah.
maximize your production in a small area, right? It's okay.
Eggplant?
It's another hard one, yeah. Yeah. It likes that lots of warm nights. If you're going to go pepper, make sure you plant in a pot so it's right against the south side of your house, lots of extra heat. That one does do better inside a greenhouse if you have it.
I was told, I'm not sure if it's a myth or not, but I was told with garlic that you can actually use garlic to actually repel some of the, like growing garlic beside plants. To actually
Yeah, it repels some of the predatory bad insects, yeah.
And I was told it's actually very beneficial. I'm not sure if it's true, but beside roses, I was told roses is very good.
I've read some stuff like that too. I've never tried it to know exactly how that works, but I always grow garlic. I plant that in the fall and then harvest the next fall and then replant again in the fall. You can plant it in the spring and harvest again, but it's better if you plant in the fall and harvest the next fall. Any other questions?
Can you grow celery in Calgary?
You sure can. One thing I will warn you about celery is you have to grow it so in a trench, and then you backfill to blanch it so it stays more light green. When it's grown out in full sun, it's the most intense celery flavor you've ever. It's nothing like you get in the grocery store. It's not that light yellow. It's super dark green and really celery flavor. Like almost, if you normally use half a cup, you'd probably need to use a couple teaspoons, because that's how intense when it's in full sun. So what you do is you grow in a trench and backfill to keep it blanched so it's not out in the sun, to keep it light green, and then it's not as intense. Yeah.
How about asparagus? Because we do have like 3 asparagus growing out every year, but
Yeah.
it's like just one twig.
Yeah, it takes a while. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Usually, to use an example of an 8 by 24 bed feeds one family. Just to use an example of, so you, for amount you need to like, and you only get one or two feedings out of that for a family. But yeah, and it takes 3 years to get each clump big enough so that you can start harvesting.
Because we do have like three little one in the front.
Yeah.
Legs, okay? And it's been there now for about 4 years.
Yeah.
You know, we get the majestic long,
Yeah,
thing.
and then they leaf out and they look like a big fern. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's one of those things you need volume. Yeah. It takes a lot, like when you buy in the grocery store, that's like a lot of production went into that to get that large production. Yeah. Because when we worked on the farm, it was literally that 8 by 24 foot roll was for the family that I worked for, and we never even harvested. That's how much it took to just get feedings. So don't feel bad if you're not getting enough. You need a lot of area.
Well, we saw some actually there's a dog park by our house.
Yeah.
We saw some natural growth and like nice and like big stem too. Like we didn't touch it, we left them there. But
Yeah. Yeah, and you only harvest 1/3 of when they get mature after 3 years. You're only removing 1/3 of that every year. So you're not, from each stem, you're not getting very many. Yeah, it takes a lot of work. Yeah.
what type of a plant or vegetable would grow under pine trees?
We try everything.
No. Unfortunately, no. In a container, you could grow lettuce or a leafy crop, as long as it's in full sun, but nothing can compete with that spruce tree for water.
No, we do have mushrooms growing under.
Yeah, but that's a completely different organism.
A
Yeah.
bunch of morels one time.
Yeah. Yeah. Perfect. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope you guys learned something. And and there'll be another talk next Saturday at 11 o'clock as well.
What is next Saturday again?
Container garden. Yeah. 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 Every Saturday at 11 for the spring. Yeah.
Good. That's great.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.